The mountains always woke before the people did. Long before any human voice drifted across the ridges, the high peaks stirred with the soft groaning of ice shifting against stone, with the whisper of thin air sliding over jagged cliffs. In the faintest blue-gray before dawn, when the world seemed to hold its breath, these ancient giants glowed with a cold, quiet patience. They had watched countless storms collapse against their sides, watched rivers claw their way through valleys, watched birds carve circles in the high sky. And now, in this early chapter of human wandering, they watched a small band of travelers, tired, hopeful, silent, approach their slopes for the first time. The first settlers arrived slowly, as if unsure whether they were truly welcome. Each step upward felt like a test. Frost clung stubbornly to the grass, forming tiny white feathers that crackled beneath every footprint. The cold bit at their ankles, slipping through thin leather wrappings. Their breaths emerged as pale clouds, drifting upward and dissolving into the morning stillness. They were not many, only 3 families traveling together, bound by kinship and necessity. Their journey from the valley below had been long, and the night before had offered little warmth. They had slept in a shallow rock overhang, listening to the unfamiliar sigh of wind weaving through distant pine. But as the first light pushed over the peaks, the mountains revealed themselves more fully, not just as obstacles, but as a landscape both dangerous and strangely beautiful. A young woman named Anura paused first. She stood on a small rise, letting her gaze stretch across the layers of pale blue ridges, fatting into the horizon like waves frozen in time. She drew in a slow breath, cold enough to sting but clean in a way valley air never was. Behind her, an older man, her father, adjusted the straps of a heavy basket on his back. "Not much farther," he murmured, though his voice was low, almost respectful in the presence of so much stone and sky. But Anura did not respond. Instead, she let her thoughts drift quietly. She wondered what these mountains had seen before them, what creatures walked these paths, what storms shaped these cliffs, what stories the wind carried from one ridge to another. Her people had never lived in such high places. Their ancestors had stayed near rivers and forests, where the soil was soft and the seasons forgiving. But too many strangers had come to those fertile lands, too many disputes, too many threats. And so these 3 families had climbed upward, searching for a new beginning carved in the bones of the earth. The trail became steeper. Loose stones tumbled with each careful step. Their calves tightened, their breaths grew shorter in the thinning air, yet something in that climb steadied them, a rhythm, a heartbeat shared with the land. Step, breathe, listen. Step, breathe, listen. A quiet repetition that felt almost like prayer. A small boy, no older than 6, clung to his mother's hand and looked with wide eyes at the towering cliffs around them. Each time a breeze rustled through the narrow pass, he squeezed her hand a little tighter. But he did not cry. Even he, in his young, wordless way, sensed the solemnity of the place. Mountains had a way of silencing fears by swallowing them into their vastness. After several hours, the travelers reached a small plateau, a flat shoulder of land not far below the first line of pines. Here, the air warmed slightly as the sun finally broke over the highest ridge, spilling long golden rays across the frost. The light illuminated the ground in shimmering patches, turning the frost into a field of tiny crystals that sparkled like scattered stars. The family stopped. For the first time since sunrise, someone whispered a note of wonder. "It's peaceful," Anura said softly, brushing her fingers through the frosted grass. The crystals melted instantly against her warm skin, leaving behind droplets that ran down her palm. She watched them fall and thought, almost absently, that beginnings often felt like endings, and endings like beginnings. This land, untouched and quiet, carried both feelings at once. The plateau was not large, but it held a sense of shelter. A curve of rock formed a natural barrier on one side. A cluster of stubborn shrubs grew low to the ground, still holding onto the last traces of green despite the cold. And just beyond, a thin trail wound downward toward the distant sound of running water. The older men exchanged glances. They approached the edge of the plateau, listening carefully. The stream sounded small but steady, an encouraging sign. Water meant survival, but they did not speak their hopes aloud. Speaking them might break the fragile spell of morning. Anura's father knelt on one knee, scooping a handful of soil. It was rocky, dry in parts, but not lifeless. He crumbled it between his fingers, feeling its weight, smelling the faint scent of earth and minerals. This was not valley soil. It would never give generously, but with patience, with care, with time, it could give enough. He nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "We can rest here," he said at last. The family set down their bundles, shoulders relaxed. Tired feet felt the ground again without the burden of weight. For a long moment, no one moved further. They stood and simply breathed, letting the thin, crisp air fill their lungs. The mountains around them remained silent, observing without judgment. It was then in that quiet pause that the true beginning settled over them, not in words, not in declarations, but in the deep, unspoken understanding that this place would shape their lives. The mountains did not rush. They had seen centuries pass like drifting clouds, and now they would watch these people too, watch them struggle, adapt, learn, and eventually belong. As the sun rose higher, golden light spilled across the plateau, warming their faces. A soft breeze drifted up from the valley, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and distant water. Birds circled high overhead, calling out in short, sharp notes that echoed faintly across the cliffs. The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Will we stay here?" he whispered. She knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "For a while," she said gently, "long enough to see what the mountains will show us." And indeed, that was how early kingdoms began. Not with thrones or banners or battles, but with a single moment of stillness, when a group of weary travelers stood upon unfamiliar ground and chose to trust its silence. The mountains leaned over them like ancient guardians. The frost began to melt. The day opened slowly, like a hand unclenching after a long night. And in that unfolding, the seeds of a highland empire, tiny, fragile, uncertain, were quietly planted in the thin mountain air. After the sun climbed a little higher over the plateau, the families began to move again, though this time with a gentler pace. The first day's climb had left their muscles stiff, their lungs still adjusting to the thin air, but the plateau offered a kind of quiet encouragement. It was here, among frost-tipped grass and stubborn shrubs, that they would attempt the first true act of permanence, building shelters. Not grand structures, not walls that would echo with the authority of kings, but small, humble spaces where fire could burn and bodies could rest, where they could begin to listen to the land and understand its subtle language. The process began slowly, almost meditatively. Stones were gathered from nearby outcrops, rounded, rough, some with thin veins of quartz glimmering faintly in the sunlight. Each stone was lifted and rolled carefully, testing its weight and balance, the fingers pressing against its cold surface, feeling for cracks and weaknesses. The settlers learned that the stones themselves seemed to speak, offering hints about where they could best be placed, which would resist the winds that never truly slept. Every movement was deliberate, every placement measured, as if the mountain itself were a teacher and they, students who had forgotten their first lessons. Timbers were next. Long branches, stripped of bark and cleared of twigs, were laid across stones, forming the skeletons of the first shelters. The air smelled sharply of pine resin, mixed with the faint tang of frost. Hands became sticky and raw as the settlers tied pieces together with strips of dried hide, experimenting with knots, with tension, with the subtle mechanics that would allow the structure to endure wind, snow, and rain. Children watched curiously, imitating movements with smaller sticks, their laughter soft and cautious, careful not to disturb the serious rhythm of labor. Every strike of a branch against stone, every tug of a knot, every careful step over loose pebbles became part of a quiet, shared language between humans and their new home. The elders, those who had lived through harsher valleys and harsher winters, moved with a kind of calm authority, not shouting instructions but demonstrating, letting hands show what words could not. One elderly man knelt, turning a particularly stubborn branch, pressing it into place. He let it wobble slightly, then adjusted it with small, careful shifts. "The hill will tell you," he murmured softly to a boy watching, as if the mountain itself might correct mistakes if one only paused to listen. There was a rhythm in this work. Lift, place, pause, listen. Repeat. And slowly the language of the hill became apparent. The way wind curved through the ridge, the angle at which frost formed overnight, the subtle way sunlight would warm one corner of a stone more than another. Shelter was not merely protection. It was understanding, negotiation with a living, breathing landscape. Time moved differently here. Minutes stretched into hours as the settlers measured, adjusted, and tested. A small hut slowly emerged from stone and timber, modest in size but monumental in effort. Smoke curled from a tiny fire pit dug within, carrying the faint aroma of wet leaves and kindling into the crisp air. The light reflected off frost crystals, casting tiny, dancing shadows across the interior. Inside it was quiet and warm. Outside the wind continued to swirl, indifferent but steady. Standing within that fragile hut, one could feel the boundary between the human world and the mountain world, close, delicate, intimate. The settlers experimented with insulation. Moss, carefully stripped from shaded rocks, was pressed between walls and roof. Thin layers of dried grasses were tucked into gaps. Each small adjustment carried lessons. Some patches trapped heat, others allowed drafts that cut through with icy fingers. Fingers were chilled and raw from constant contact with frost and sap, and yet the effort brought a satisfaction that was quiet but deep, a satisfaction that grew from understanding the world rather than trying to command it. Night approached slowly. The first fire was lit properly, small but steady, flickering against walls and casting a soft glow that pushed away the lengthening shadows. The settlers sat around it, warming their hands, tasting the slightly smoky scent in their mouths. The youngest children rested their heads against their mothers' knees, eyes heavy with the effort of the day. Anira, exhausted but alert, sat at the edge of the shelter, brushing loose strands of hair from her face and listening to the wind as it sighed against the walls. She noticed how differently it moved here, how it wrapped around corners, rushed through narrow gaps, and occasionally paused as if contemplating the work humans had done. She wondered what the mountain might think of them. Was it amused or indifferent or quietly approving? She had learned that life in these high places required listening more than speaking. And listening was not just hearing the wind or the stones. It was noticing the silence in between, the pause between footsteps, the tremble of frost-laden grass when disturbed. Each moment contained a lesson if one only waited and watched. As darkness settled fully, the families arranged themselves around the fire, sharing a simple meal: dried meat, hard bread, and water drawn from a small collected pool. The flavors were simple, but they carried weight, the taste of survival, of effort, of land wrested carefully from indifferent stone. Each bite seemed to affirm their presence in a new world. There was a slow rhythm to eating, a quiet repetition that mimicked the day's labor: lift, place, pause, grind, chew, swallow, listen, observe, breathe. The mountain seemed to echo it back, steady and patient, as if teaching the art of endurance. Before sleep, Anira's father rose quietly, moving to the edge of the plateau to glance down the slope where streams meandered like silver threads in the fading light. He inhaled deeply, tasting the thin air and the faint mineral scent of rock. This was more than just survival. This was communion. Here every stone, every gust of wind, every patch of frost spoke to those willing to listen. To live here was to learn the mountain's vocabulary, a language shaped by patience, observation, and respect. And in that quiet communion, the settlers understood a truth that would echo through generations. The mountain does not grant dominance lightly. It grants understanding slowly, through labor, attention, and humility. The first night passed under the whispering wind. Sleep was light, punctuated by the occasional groan of timber or rustle of a small animal in the shrubs outside. Dreams were filled with jagged peaks and winding paths, streams that glimmered like threads of silver, and the quiet faces of ancestors long imagined. The settlers awoke the next morning to the same light, the same frost, the same wind, and yet the world felt slightly altered. They had begun to belong. They had begun to speak, in action and in thought, the language of the hills. This was the first lesson of the mountains. Permanence was slow. Trust was earned one careful step at a time. Shelter was not just a structure but a covenant with the land, a promise of patience and care. And in learning to listen to the wind, the stones, and the frost, the settlers laid the groundwork not only for survival, but for the beginnings of something larger, a quiet civilization shaped by altitude, endurance, and reverence for the peaks that watched over them. And so, as the sun rose and bathed the new shelters in a warm, fragile light, the first whispers of a mountain kingdom breathed into being. Not yet rulers or kings, these people were students, apprentices of the cliffs and valleys, learning slowly how to carve life out of rock and frost. And in that learning, in the quiet labor and careful observation, the mountain began to recognize them, not as intruders, not as mere wanderers, but as inhabitants capable of listening to its vast, patient language. Nightfall in the highlands carried a different weight than it did in the valleys below. The air, thinner and colder, seemed almost to crystallize around each breath. The first shelters had been built, and the settlers had learned with slow, careful hands how to bend stone and timber to their will. But survival alone was never enough. Even in the harshest climates, humans found ways to gather, to mark time, to honor one another and the land that sustained them. And so, in the dimming light, as frost gleamed faintly on the slopes and shadows stretched long across terraces, the first community rituals quietly took form. The center of the plateau became a gathering place. A small fire pit had been dug, lined with flat stones, its edges blackened from previous test fires. Smoke spiraled upward, thin and pale against the darkening sky, curling and twisting as if trying to whisper messages to the peaks above. Around it, families circled instinctively, dragging small logs to sit upon, arranging themselves so that everyone could see one another. The wind pressed against them, a constant, murmuring presence, but the fire offered warmth and focus, a single point around which the community's attention could converge. No words were immediately spoken. Instead, there was a rhythm, hands arranging logs, the scrape of stone against earth as someone adjusted the fire pit, the soft shuffle of feet on frost. Even the children, who had been restless earlier, grew quiet, sensing the solemnity of the hour. The settlers had begun to realize that these rituals were less about ceremony and more about creating a shared heartbeat, a collective acknowledgement that they were not alone in this harsh, demanding land. The elders were the first to break the silence. They leaned closer to the fire, allowing its warmth to brush their faces, and spoke in soft murmurs, half explanatory, half reflective. One woman, her hair streaked with frost and gray, shared a memory of the valleys they had left behind. The sound of water running through familiar stones, the rustle of grain in gentle wind, the smell of autumn leaves pressed underfoot. It was a story of both loss and continuity, a quiet meditation on movement, change, and endurance. No one interrupted. They merely listened, the firelight flickering across attentive faces, casting long shadows on the rocks behind them. Smoke wound through the air, mingling with the faint metallic scent of frost on stone. The settlers inhaled deeply, tasting it on their tongues, letting it mingle with the remnants of their meager meals. Dried meat, hardened bread, the faint tang of fresh snow melted into drinking water. Every sensory detail was amplified in the highlands. Sounds carried farther, scents lingered longer, the smallest movement seemed to hold meaning. The fire became not only warmth but a focal point for the senses, a mirror of the human heart, steady, fragile, capable of growth. Slowly, the group began to participate in a series of small rituals, each act seemingly mundane but layered with purpose. Hands were washed in cold stream water, a gesture of respect and purification. Stones were laid around the fire, not for construction but for marking space, creating boundaries that symbolized safety and order. Leaves were collected and arranged in patterns, representing cycles of life and the passing of seasons. Each motion was deliberate, repeated in quiet succession, a hypnotic rhythm that reinforced the sense of unity. Step, place, pause, step, place, pause. Movement mirrored thought, careful, attentive, meditative. The children were included naturally, not as passive observers but as participants in the ritual. They learned to place stones with care, to fetch water without spilling a drop, to observe the wind's direction and the stars' first appearance in the emerging night sky. Their laughter, soft and restrained, mingled with the crackle of fire and the whisper of the wind. In these moments, the elders understood and the young absorbed that rituals were less about formal teaching and more about immersive experience, learning the unspoken laws of the Highlands, the rhythms that would sustain them, and the quiet logic of mountain life. In one moment, Anira rose to her feet and walked a short distance from the fire. She knelt beside a frost-hardened shrub, feeling the prickling needles beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes, inhaling the cold, sharp scent of the pine and the subtle metallic tang of the soil beneath. In that quiet, meditative pause, she reflected on the mountain's patience. The peaks had existed for millennia, impervious to human ambition. And yet humans had begun to leave their trace subtly, almost reverently. Footprints on paths, smoke from fires, small shelters clinging to slopes. Each act was small, almost imperceptible in the vastness of the Highlands, yet together they wove a narrative of survival, adaptation, and respect. Returning to the fire, she noticed how shadows danced along the rocks, elongated and warped, as if the mountains themselves were performing a slow, deliberate ritual alongside the humans. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint call of a distant bird and the whisper of snow settling on higher slopes. The community listened collectively, sensing without words that these sounds, these subtle natural signals, were part of the same rhythm. Breath, movement, firelight, wind, they were all notes in the quiet symphony of life in the Highlands. Food was shared around the fire in deliberate, contemplative gestures. Each bite was slow, mindful, almost ceremonial. The taste of dried meat was stronger in the thin air, the bread slightly more substantial than in lower valleys, the water tasting of minerals and stone, a reminder that sustenance came not just from preparation, but from attentive observation of one's environment. Sharing food became more than nourishment. It became a reaffirmation of collective endurance, a tacit promise that each member would continue, step by careful step, through the long days ahead. As darkness deepened, the settlers turned their gaze upward. Stars appeared in silence, scattered across the vast expanse of sky like frozen sparks. They blinked slowly, distant and steady, forming patterns that mirrored the constellations remembered from the valleys below. For the first time, the settlers noticed how different the heavens felt from these high altitudes, their brilliance sharper, their cold presence more commanding. Some children pointed, nomming shapes and imagining stories, while the elders allowed their eyes to wander, letting the sky guide reflection. Every glance upward became a meditation, connecting the human rhythm with the eternal rhythm of mountains and stars. The night stretched slowly, each hour measured by the crackle of embers and the gentle sigh of wind. Occasionally, someone would add a small branch to the fire, the sparks rising like tiny echoes of stars into the still night. Movement, repetition, breath, observation. These elements intertwined to form the first shared rituals, rhythms that would persist for generations, quiet foundations of a culture attuned to mountains, seasons, and survival. Through firelight and smoke, through breath and frost, the settlers learned that community was not built solely on shelter or food, but on shared attention, care, and the silent acknowledgement of the world around them. When sleep finally approached, it was deep and undisturbed. Even the children, lulled by the hypnotic rhythm of wind, fire, and murmured reflections, rested without fear. Dreams were filled with flickering flames, glittering frost, soaring cliffs, and the faint whisper of ancestral valleys. And in the quiet mind of each settler, A new understanding had taken root, that the rituals they performed, so simple and slow, were a bridge between survival and belonging, between fear and mastery, between wandering and settling. The mountains watched, and in turn, the humans learned, slowly, patiently, the first rules of life that would one day sustain kingdoms carved from peaks and stone. The morning after the first firelight ritual, the settlers awoke to a world brushed with frost and shadow, a landscape that seemed both familiar and utterly new. The plateau beneath the rising sun shimmered with a delicate, icy glow, and the air, still thin and biting, carried the scent of stone and pine sap. After several days of labor and ritual, the settlers began to turn their attention outward, not inward, to the surrounding slopes, cliffs, and hidden valleys. If the first shelters were their roots, then the land beyond would become the arteries of life, the streams, ledges, and paths they would need to navigate in order to survive. And so, they embarked on the slow, deliberate work of mapping the mountains. Their movements were careful. Every step along the uneven ground required attention. The crackle of frost underfoot, the subtle wobble of loose stones, the occasional snap of a twig hidden beneath the ice. The settlers learned to read these small signs, to notice the texture of the soil, the way the wind bent grasses, the direction of shadows at different hours. Each detail was a clue, a guide to understanding the Highlands. One misstep could mean injury, one overlooked slope could mean being lost. And yet, this careful observation became almost meditative, a slow immersion in the rhythm of the mountains. Streams were the first focus. Small rivulets trickled down from snowmelt, their water so clear that it seemed to shimmer with a pale blue light, twisting over rock and moss with a gentle murmur. The settlers followed these streams upstream and downstream, nodding where the water slowed in shallow pools, where it cascaded over rocks, and where it disappeared into narrow fissures. The sound of moving water carried in the crisp air, sometimes echoing across valleys, sometimes muffled by dense thickets of pine. Each bend, each ripple, each sudden drop became a landmark, a natural guidepost that shaped their emerging mental map of the terrain. Children accompanied the adults, small hands occasionally dipping into the icy stream, squealing at the sharp sting of cold, then pulling back to watch the water swirl away. They learned quickly which rocks were stable and which shifted under weight, which shallow pools held fish and which were too shallow to sustain life. Their laughter, brief and restrained, was a gentle counterpoint to the constant whisper of water. Step by careful step, the settlers built an intimate knowledge of the landscape, not merely a physical map but an emotional and sensory one, layered with memory, smell, and touch. The settlers also marked their paths in subtle ways. Stones stacked in small cairns, scratches on bark, and broken branches bent to indicate direction became quiet guides for future journeys. These markers were never ostentatious. They existed as whispers of communication, a way to ensure that even in the thickest fog or heaviest snow, someone following the same streams could navigate without panic. Observing and recording became a ritual in itself, a careful dialogue with the terrain, teaching humans patience and humility in equal measure. Time unfolded slowly in the Highlands. The sun rose and fell, casting elongated shadows that shifted gradually across slopes and ledges. Snowfields reflected light in a spectrum of blues and whites, while shaded crevices held dark pools of hidden cold. The settlers learned to note these differences, which areas retained ice long after the sun had risen, which slopes warmed enough to grow moss or shrubs, and where wild game might venture at dawn. Each observation was a thread, contributing to a living tapestry of understanding that would guide them in hunting, grazing, and planting in the days to come. As the settlers climbed higher, the wind became a constant companion. It pressed against their faces and hands, carrying both the faint scent of distant pine forests and the sharp bite of mineral-laden snow. At first, the wind seemed to push them back, to challenge their determination. But gradually, they began to read it. The shift in its direction indicated coming storms. The way it gathered in narrow passes revealed hidden channels, and the subtle hush in its movement signaled sheltered pockets where they could rest. In listening to the wind, they were learning another layer of the mountain's language, a dialogue as essential as the murmur of streams. Water, the settlers realized, dictated much of life in the highlands. Streams provided drink, nourishment for livestock, and natural boundaries for settlements. They also indicated fertile terraces and the safest routes to travel. Mapping the streams meant mapping survival itself. But the settlers did not simply record locations on a physical level. They remembered shapes, sounds, and smells, creating mental landmarks that were inseparable from the sensations experienced while observing them. This form of memory, slow and tactile, was more enduring than any sketch or map could offer. The plateau and its surrounding slopes revealed more secrets as the day wore on. Hidden pockets of soil, sheltered from wind, showed traces of early mosses and hardy grasses that might be cultivated. Small clusters of berries, resistant to frost, were discovered in crevices of rock. Birds called from high perches, sometimes swooping close enough to be observed, offering insight into migration patterns and seasonal changes. Every element, no matter how minute, was absorbed into the settlers' consciousness, forming a network of knowledge that would sustain them across years and generations. Internal reflection accompanied all these observations. Anira often paused, kneeling beside a stream to let her hands rest in the icy water, contemplating the strange balance of fragility and endurance around her. The mountains seemed indifferent, yet infinitely patient. Life here demanded vigilance, patience, and adaptability. She thought about how this landscape would shape her children's children, how the slow accumulation of understanding, stone by stone, path by path, would eventually lead to something greater, a community rooted in place, resilient against storms, and in harmony with the subtle logic of the peaks. By late afternoon, the settlers had traced several kilometers of ridges and valleys, noting safe passages, reliable water sources, and places for future cultivation. Their notebooks, rough sketches etched in bark or pressed into clay tablets, captured only a fraction of what their senses had learned. The mountain story was not fully recordable. It was to be lived, repeated, and observed continually. And in this patient, ongoing engagement with the land, the early settlers began to understand what it meant to claim a home in the highlands, not by force or conquest, but by listening, following, and remembering. As twilight approached, the group returned to the first shelters. Their clothing was damp from snowmelt and frost, their hands raw from handling stones and water, yet their spirits carried a quiet satisfaction. They had not merely walked, they had conversed with the land, learned its rhythms, and begun to embed themselves into its pattern. In that intimate communion, the first threads of a highland identity took root, a culture defined by observation, endurance, and attentive participation in the slow choreography of mountains, wind, and water. That night, as the settlers gathered again around the fire, the streams whispered just beyond the plateau, a gentle murmur reminding them of the day's discoveries. Smoke rose lazily into the cold, star-filled sky, and the mountains leaned over them like timeless guardians. Each ember seemed to hold memory, the shimmer of frost, the murmur of water, the feel of stone beneath fingers, the pulse of the wind through pines. And as the settlers shared food, stories, and quiet reflection, they understood that mapping the land was more than geography. It was an act of communion, a recognition that life in the highlands required patience, reverence, and the continuous, gentle act of listening. By the time sleep settled over the plateau, the streams had been traced, the paths remembered, and the settlers had begun to inhabit the landscape in body, mind, and spirit. And in the slow rhythm of their lives, step by step, stone by stone, stream by stream, the mountain itself began to acknowledge them as inhabitants, students of its enduring, patient logic. The settlers awoke to a sun that had begun to climb higher over the ridges, spilling its weak warmth across frost-tipped grass and rocky soil. The mountains, patient as ever, observed without haste. For days, the people had walked, listened, mapped, and built. Now they turned to a more deliberate form of transformation, the shaping of the land itself. Terracing the slopes, cutting steps into the stubborn stone and soil, was not simply labor. It was a rhythm, a dialogue with the earth, a slow negotiation that would shape both sustenance and settlement for generations to come. Anira knelt beside the first slope chosen for cultivation. The soil was thin, rocky, and partially frozen. Each handful was examined, pressed, sifted, and returned with care. The faint smell of wet earth, mingled with mineral dust, rose into her nose, anchoring her to the immediate moment. Every stone she removed, every clump of soil she loosened, was both a small victory and a lesson in patience. The mountain did not yield easily. It required persistence, attention, and a willingness to adjust to its contours rather than impose upon them. The first terraces took days, each step slow and precise. Stones were pried loose with crude levers, sometimes slipping and falling back with a hollow clatter. Timber supports were wedged beneath overhanging rock, the smell of resin strong in the crisp air. Water, carefully channeled from higher streams, would later flow across these terraces, nourishing early crops. But for now, the settlers' work was tactile, immediate, and meditative. Hands grew raw, muscles ached, yet the rhythm, lift, place, measure, pause, became almost hypnotic, a slow dance in which both human and mountain participated. The elders guided each motion. They had learned through experience in other lower valleys the subtle ways in which soil and stone could support life. But here at altitude they had to relearn. Frost heaved at night, loosening clumps, shifting rocks. Winds threatened to blow loose earth from the edges. And yet these challenges became part of the lesson. Adjustments were made carefully. Small walls of stone reinforced terraces, gaps filled with moss to trap moisture, channels dug to guide runoff gently down the slope. Each modification was a whisper to the mountain. We respect you, we will adapt, we will learn. Children followed in quiet fascination, carrying small stones or assisting with bundles of straw. Their small hands were clumsy but eager, and the elders allowed them to try, to learn through repetition. One child carefully placed a flat stone, stepping back to admire the small ripple of order it created in the slope. The action was small, almost insignificant, yet it was part of the same long story of shaping the Highlands. Each terrace, no matter how modest, was a victory of patience over indifference, a tangible proof that the mountain could, slowly, be made to serve life. As the sun rose higher, casting elongated shadows across the terraces, Anira paused to observe the work. The slope was transforming, but very gradually. Stones and soil formed a pattern of steps, channels, and walls that promised sustenance but demanded careful maintenance. She pressed her hands into the earth, feeling its weight and texture, and wondered about generations to come, about children who would tread these terraces, who would taste the grain grown from this slow labor, who would understand the mountain not as an enemy but as a silent collaborator in human persistence. The wind moved constantly, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, carrying with it the faint scent of high-altitude flora. Small birds flitted between shrubs, occasionally alighting on newly placed stones, curious about the strange, clumsy activity. The settlers paid them little mind. The rhythm of labor was already hypnotic. Lift, place, pause, lift, place, pause. Repetition became a form of meditation. The mountain spoke in wind and frost, in the subtle shift of soil underfoot. To listen, one had to move slowly, deliberately, with awareness of every sound, every texture, every detail of the slope. Midday arrived with light bright enough to reflect sharply from frost and stone. The settlers paused to drink from small pools, tasting the water that carried minerals and life alike. Food was simple: a handful of dried berries, a small piece of bread, the occasional sip of leftover warm water from a fire. Yet in this simplicity lay a profound satisfaction. Each bite was a reminder of effort, of adaptation, of the slow cultivation not only of the land but of endurance itself. Work was nourishment in body. Observation was nourishment for the mind, and every terrace carved into the mountain was a promise for the future. By afternoon, the terraces had begun to take recognizable shape. Even in their unfinished state, they suggested order, foresight, and patience. Anira walked along one edge, testing her footing on the newly flattened soil, feeling the firm but yielding earth beneath her boots. She noted the subtle angle of each step, the careful alignment of stone walls, and the channels intended to guide water gently across the slope. This was not mere survival. This was intentional creation, an act that required mindfulness, reflection, and deep engagement with the rhythms of nature. As the light faded, the settlers gathered again around the fire. The day's labor had left them exhausted but fulfilled. Smoke rose lazily, blending with the thin chill of evening air, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet soil. Food was shared with quiet appreciation. Words were few, as the mind still lingered in the patterns of stone, soil, and water. Children nestled close to parents, listening to the low murmur of adults recounting small observations of the day. The angle of a stone, the way frost collected in certain hollows, the unexpected flow of water in a newly dug channel. Each detail was repeated, internalized, and remembered. The settlers lay on rough mats inside their shelters, exhausted but reflective. Sleep arrived slowly, punctuated by the occasional sigh of wind or distant rustle of nocturnal creatures. Dreams carried the image of terraces climbing slopes, streams winding between stones, sunlight dancing on frost. The mountain, ever patient, seemed to acknowledge the human efforts. It did not reward them with immediate abundance. It demanded continued attention, respect, and humility. But in return, it offered structure, guidance, and the slow promise of sustenance. Through these first terraces, the settlers learned that highland life was a negotiation. Victory came not through force but through patience. Power did not rise overnight. It grew incrementally, stone by stone, step by step. Terracing the mountain was the first visible sign of this truth, that human persistence, when combined with careful observation and respect for the land, could transform inhospitable slopes into places capable of sustaining life. In this rhythm, lift, place, measure, pause, the settlers began to experience what it truly meant to belong to the Highlands, and what it meant to be listened to, by a landscape that taught slowly, insistently, and profoundly. And as the moon rose over the slopes, casting silver light across the newly formed terraces, the settlers understood that this labor, repetitive and painstaking, was far more than physical effort. It was a meditation. It was a ritual. It was the quiet forging of the first enduring bond between people and mountain, a bond that would quietly shape the identity, culture, and eventual power of the highland kingdoms yet to come. The mountains had a rhythm all their own, a cadence that humans could only partially perceive. One morning the wind arrived with a whisper, subtle at first, curling over the slopes like an unnoticed guest. By afternoon it had grown insistent, tugging at the edges of shelters, rattling branches, and making the thin smoke from their hearths rise straight and sharp. And by evening it roared, a voice of nature demanding attention, testing patience, endurance, and ingenuity. The settlers, now familiar with the slopes, had learned to listen to the wind. But storms in the highlands were different from anything they had known below. They were not merely weather. They were trials, shaping character as surely as the terraces shaped the earth. Anira rose early that day to inspect the first terraces. Clouds were thick and low, like a heavy woolen blanket pulled across the peaks. The air smelled damp, metallic with the promise of rain or snow, and the wind pressed against her thin cloak with insistent fingers. Stones in the terraces had shifted slightly during the night, loosened by frost that had melted and refrozen. She knelt and adjusted a small wall, pressing moss and soil into gaps, her fingers numbed by cold but her focus unwavering. Each action was deliberate, each pause a reflection. The mountain demanded respect, not panic. Survival depended on patience. The elders gathered at the edge of the plateau to assess the wind. Their eyes followed the movement of clouds, noting the dark streaks that hinted at incoming snow, the swirls of fog that twisted around ridges. "It will press against us tonight," one muttered. "We must be ready." But there was no fear, only calculation. The settlers understood that the mountain storms were neither friend nor foe, they were tests. To endure them required vigilance, care, and an intimate understanding of the land they had chosen. By afternoon, the storm was undeniable. Rain began as a fine mist, turning to heavy droplets that splashed against stones and soil. The wind bent trees to its will, tugged at the wooden frames of shelters, and filled every corner with an urgent, low howl. Children huddled close to parents, shivering under layers of wool and furs. The settlers moved methodically, securing timbers, reinforcing stone walls, and directing runoff from the terraces to prevent erosion. Each motion was a rehearsal, practiced in quiet anticipation. The mountain dictated the pace, and the people adapted, a slow dance of labor and observation. The fire, a small heart at the center of their shelters, became a focal point for warmth and reassurance. Smoke spiraled upward, twisting against the wind while the settlers sat close, hands extended toward the flickering glow. Food was shared, quiet and deliberate, chewed slowly to savor warmth and sustenance. The taste of dried meat, softened by the damp air, and bread, dense and filling, became more than nourishment. They were anchors, moments of control and comfort in an otherwise unpredictable world. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow began to fall, drifting first lightly, then in thick crystalline sheets that smothered the terraces and blurred the edges of the plateau. Visibility shrank and the roar of wind filled every silence. It was impossible to ignore the power pressing down from above. And yet the settlers did not panic. They had prepared. Stones had been reinforced, shelters tied and braced, water channels dug and tested. Each precaution, measured carefully over days and weeks, now proved its worth. The mountain demanded vigilance, and they had answered. Anira moved slowly along the terraces, testing the drainage channels, pressing snow away from stones, ensuring that the fragile walls held. Each terrace, each stone, each clump of moss became part of a silent dialogue. She listened not only to the wind but to the subtle shifts in the soil, the creaking of timber, the splash of water diverted from its usual path. Every sound was a signal, every movement a response. Survival was a conversation, patient and attentive between human and highland. Night fell slowly, heavy with storm. Inside the shelters, the settlers sat close, leaning into warmth, breathing deeply and listening. The sound of wind over the cliffs, the sharp rattle of loose stones, and the distant groan of timber all became part of a rhythmic meditation. Sleep was fractured but reflective. Dreams mingled with the sound of snow piling on terraces and roofs. In these moments, the settlers realized that leadership did not belong to those who shouted or commanded. It belonged to those who observed, anticipated, and acted with quiet foresight. Storms revealed character, endurance, and the subtle hierarchies that would shape their community. By dawn, the storm had begun to relent. Snow lay thick on the terraces, glittering in the pale light. Small channels carved by runoff were visible. Stones had shifted but held firm, and shelters had survived, creaking but intact. The settlers emerged slowly, inhaling the crisp, clean scent of post-storm air, tinged with wet pine, mineral soil, and the subtle sweetness of frost melting into water. Each breath was a reminder of resilience. Each step onto the flattened terraces a testament to patience, skill, and adaptation. Children ran cautiously along paths, leaving tiny footprints in the snow, learning early the necessity of careful movement in these high places. The elders inspected terraces, repaired walls, and adjusted channels, speaking softly, almost to themselves, in low tones that echoed the rhythm of labor and observation. Anira knelt beside a frost-covered stone, feeling its cold weight and smooth surface, reflecting on how the storm had not destroyed them but had reminded them to listen, to move with care, and to respect the mountain's own patterns of power. The day was spent in recovery and reflection. Food was prepared slowly, water drawn from streams partially thawed by the storm. Settlers shared observations, noting weak spots, wind paths, and subtle shifts in snow and soil. Every detail mattered. In these quiet, careful conversations, the foundations of leadership, organization, and shared responsibility were solidified. The mountain, ever patient, had tested them, and in doing so taught them not only endurance but foresight, caution, and subtle cooperation. By evening, the storm was a memory etched into the landscape. Snow glittered on terraces and ledges, frost clung stubbornly to pine needles and shrubs. The settlers gathered around the fire, sharing warmth, food, and stories of what they had observed. Step by step, terrace by terrace, channel by channel, they had survived. And in this survival lay a lesson that would shape the emerging Highland society. The mountain would not be conquered, but it could be understood, anticipated, and respected. Leadership, community, and continuity would grow slowly, in measured, deliberate steps, much like the terraces carved into its slopes. As night fell and the wind quieted to a soft murmur, the settlers lay in their shelters, listening to the distant echoes of snow and ice settling. Dreams were filled with terraces, torrents of snow, and the quiet persistence of stone. In the rhythm of storm and calm, observation and response, the settlers learned their earliest truths. Patience, vigilance, and respect were the foundations upon which any Highland kingdom would be built. And in the thin, cold air of the mountains, they understood that survival was only the beginning. Understanding the storm was the first true mastery. Winter arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The wind grew sharper, more insistent, and mornings carried a frost that lingered longer than before. Streams slowed under thin sheets of ice, and the shallow soil of terraces hardened into stone-like rigidity. Each day was shorter, the sun's light pale and fleeting, spilling over the horizon in weak, silver-gold ribbons before retreating behind jagged peaks. The settlers, now several months into their Highland life, faced the mountain's most pressing challenge. The winter season, a test of endurance, foresight, and deep adaptation. The first concern was warmth. Shelters, previously sufficient for moderate weather, now demanded careful reinforcement. Timber frames were doubled where possible. Moss and grasses were packed into every available crevice to slow the intrusion of icy wind. The smell of wet pine, combined with the faint tang of smoke from hearths, hung in the air. Even as they worked, the settlers felt the constant bite of cold in their hands and feet, reminding them that comfort was fragile, temporary, and earned through careful attention. Food storage became paramount. The settlers gathered roots, dried meats, and preserved berries, placing them in raised compartments within their shelters to prevent spoilage. The scent of drying herbs mingled with the mineral tang of frost-laden stone. Each small ration was measured, chewed slowly, and appreciated. In the cold air, flavors became sharper, the faint sweetness of dried fruit, the richness of cured meat, the faint bitterness of hard bread. Every bite reinforced not just sustenance but patience, and every stored bundle symbolized foresight, preparation, and the careful management of limited resources. Daily movement required precision. Frost slicked terraces and paths, turning routine travel into a careful negotiation with the mountain. Each step was deliberate, toes pressing into snow-crusted soil, fingers grazing frost-covered stone for balance. The settlers learned to anticipate the subtle shift in weight, to sense the hidden weakness beneath seemingly solid snow, and to move with an awareness that was both physical and mental. Children followed closely, mimicking gestures, learning early that survival in the Highlands demanded attentiveness, rhythm, and repetition. Water presented its own challenge. Streams slowed, and thin ice formed along the edges, delicate yet deceptively strong. Collecting water became a slow, deliberate task. Stones were used to break through thin ice, small pools were melted over controlled fires, and every drop was conserved carefully. The settlers noticed the faint metallic taste in high-altitude waters, the way it changed depending on where it was collected, and the subtle hints of minerals carried downstream from snowmelt. Each sip reminded them that the mountain offered life, but only if treated with patience and understanding. The wind was relentless. It howled through natural corridors and pressed against shelters with unyielding insistence. Smoke from fires rose in thin, twisting ribbons, often swept away before dispersing. The settlers learned to adjust their fires, shielding them from gusts while maintaining enough warmth for cooking and comfort. Sitting beside the flames, hands outstretched, they felt a quiet, meditative rhythm develop. Inhale the cold air, exhale slowly, observe the movement of smoke, adjust the logs, repeat. The wind, once an adversary, became a teacher, its patterns guiding shelter placement, fire management, and even the arrangement of terraces. Amid the practical concerns, the settlers maintained their quiet rituals. Fires became focal points for reflection and observation. Stories of the valley below and of ancestors were recounted softly, often with long pauses to savor the crackle of flames or the hush of snow settling on distant peaks. The soundscape was subtle but rich. The sigh of wind across frozen grasses, the distant scraping of ice against rock, the soft padding of children moving through snow. These sounds formed a rhythm that mirrored their daily tasks, embedding each action within the sensory fabric of the Highland winter. The first snowfall arrived in earnest during one quiet morning. Tiny flakes drifted through the air, sticking to the frost-laden ground and blanketing terraces in silver. The settlers paused, hands resting on stone walls, observing the movement of the snow. It fell slowly, deliberately, each flake a small miracle. The children reached out, fingers brushing the air, marveling at the delicate patterns, and even the elders allowed themselves a moment of quiet awe. The snowfall was both challenge and beauty, reminding all that the mountains demanded respect, but also offered wonder. Hunting became more measured. Wild game moved slowly, leaving tracks that froze in the cold soil, subtle signs that required careful observation. Tracking animals required attentiveness to subtle impressions in snow, the way a broken branch indicated passage, or the faint disturbance of frost along a ridge. Patience, rather than speed, became essential. The settlers learned to wait, to watch, and to move quietly, each small success reinforcing the importance of rhythm and observation. Evenings were marked by ritual around the fire. Food was shared with quiet gratitude. Smoke rose in slow, curling spirals, carrying the faint, sharp scent of pine and frost. The wind, now reduced to a constant low hum, pressed against shelters, and every sound was amplified in the cold, thin air. Settlers reflected silently on the day's challenges, minor failures, subtle victories, shifts in terraces, and the behavior of snow and ice. Every observation became part of a collective memory, a slow accumulation of knowledge critical for survival and eventual settlement consolidation. As night deepened, the sky revealed stars with a brilliance impossible in lower valleys. Each twinkling point seemed sharper, more commanding, reflecting light off snow and ice. Observing the heavens became a quiet ritual, a way to mark the passing of time, anticipate seasonal changes, and maintain a connection to the larger cosmos. Children learned early to recognize constellations, associating them with the flow of the seasons, the behavior of wildlife, and the timing of agricultural tasks. The sky was both guidance and meditation, a constant companion to the daily labor of Highland life. By the end of the first winter month, the settlers had adapted to the mountain's rhythms. Shelters were reinforced, terraces stabilized, food stores carefully monitored, and movement through snow and ice became confident and deliberate. Every task was slow, deliberate, and reflective, each small action a negotiation with the mountain's immense, patient power. The Highlands demanded humility, vigilance, and endurance, and the settlers had begun to internalize these qualities. They were not yet rulers, not yet a kingdom, but they were no longer mere wanderers. The mountain recognized their persistence, and in turn, the settlers recognized the necessity of patience, foresight, and measured adaptation, the first steps in the slow forging of Highland culture and identity. As the night deepened and the wind whispered across frozen terraces, the settlers lay in their shelters, hands warmed by fires, bodies wrapped in furs, and minds alive with reflection. They had endured frost, snow, and wind. They had listened to the mountain and learned from it. Winter was not simply a season, it was a teacher, testing endurance, patience, and foresight. And in passing these tests, the settlers laid another stone in the foundation of the Highland kingdoms yet to emerge, a quiet, deliberate beginning of civilization forged in stone, frost, and the patient rhythm of mountain life. Spring returned slowly to the highlands, a subtle shift of temperature and light that melted frost, softened soil, and encouraged life to emerge from the long, silent winter. Streams swelled with snowmelt, their water rushing with a crystal clarity that sang through valleys and over rocks. The settlers, hardened and patient from months of labor, observation, and adaptation, began to see the first tangible results of their efforts: terraces that held soil, shelters that survived storms, and a fragile but growing sense of community. Life here was still tentative, yet unmistakably alive, and in that fragile vitality, the earliest forms of Highland kingdoms quietly began to take shape. Anira walked along the first terraces, now dotted with early plantings. Roots and hardy grains had been carefully sown into the softened earth, their tiny shoots pushing through soil still rich with frost's memory. The terraces, once raw cuts into stone and soil, now held a pattern, a deliberate organization reflecting careful observation and accumulated knowledge. She ran her fingers over the soil, feeling its texture, its warmth under the spring sun, and reflected on the journey from mere survival to structured life. Every stone placed in walls, every channel dug to guide water, every shelter reinforced against storms was now part of a larger vision, not just to live, but to endure and thrive. The community had grown into a rhythm, an interlocking system of tasks and roles. Elders instructed the young in terrace maintenance, fire management, and the reading of wind and clouds. Children observed and practiced, learning to navigate rocky paths, recognize subtle shifts in the snow, and tend to the fragile plantings. Food and water, now carefully rationed and stored, were more reliable than ever. Smoke rose steadily from multiple hearths, mingling with the mineral scent of soil, pine, and melting frost. In these shared routines, the settlers developed not only competence but a sense of identity, a collective understanding of their place in the mountains. Leadership emerged naturally, not through violence or decree but through observation, wisdom, and consistent care. Those who anticipated storms, organized labor, and mediated disputes gained respect. Decisions were made collectively, but guided by those who had accumulated the most experience with the land's subtle logic. Anira's father, who had once merely assisted with labor, now helped coordinate terrace construction and food distribution. His role was quiet but essential, a steadying presence that allowed the community to function as a whole. Leadership in the Highlands was not conquest, it was stewardship, and stewardship was earned through patience, foresight, and the slow accumulation of understanding. The settlers began to perceive their world as more than survival. It was culture, ceremony, and identity in motion. Festivals and quiet rituals marked planting and harvest cycles, the return of birds, and the first signs of thawed streams. Firelight continued to provide a focal point for reflection, storytelling, and instruction. Around these flames, young and old exchanged observations: which terraces held moisture best, which slopes were safe from sudden runoff, how best to guide snowmelt without damaging walls. Every discussion was a rehearsal of memory, a meditation on observation, a subtle reinforcement of communal identity. Trade and exchange, limited at first, began to take root. Small groups moved to neighboring valleys, carrying preserved food, simple tools, and knowledge in exchange for seeds, herbs, or livestock. These interactions were tentative but significant, expanding the settlers' understanding of both geography and society. Trails established earlier through careful observation of streams and ridges now served not only survival but communication. In these exchanges, the highlands slowly transformed from isolated slopes into interconnected communities, the precursors of kingdoms. Evenings retained their reflective quality. The settlers gathered around fires, warmth spilling across cold skin, smoke curling lazily into the twilight. They listened to wind patterns, to birds returning from lower valleys, to the distant rush of streams, and in these observations they embedded collective memory. Children learn not just from instruction but from immersion, observing the subtle bend of branches, the behavior of frost, the clarity of water, the movement of animals. Every sensory detail became part of the shared narrative, a story of human persistence intertwined with the rhythms of mountains. By mid-spring, the settlers could see that their labor had altered the landscape in lasting ways. Terraces were stable, shelters resilient, and paths between them clear and predictable. Vegetation thrived where it had been coaxed into growth, and animals began to navigate the slopes in patterns the humans could anticipate. Life was no longer reactive, it was proactive. The settlers had begun to shape the highlands thoughtfully, intentionally, always with observation, patience, and respect as guides. In this shaping, the foundations of governance, social order, and territorial awareness had quietly emerged. Anira often stood at the edge of the plateau, looking out over the valleys below. Snow still lingered in pockets, streams glimmered silver under sunlight, and distant peaks rose in solemn, unyielding majesty. She reflected on the months of labor, observation, and adaptation, the shelters that survived storms, the terraces that captured soil and water, the careful rituals that structured life, and the subtle emergence of community leadership. All these acts, each painstakingly repeated, were forming the first structures of civilization in the highlands. Not palaces or armies, but shared knowledge, survival practices, and collective identity. The settlers understood that the mountains demanded more than obedience or hard work. They required insight, respect, and humility. The highlands would not bend to ambition alone. Every structure, every terrace, every ritual was a negotiation, a recognition that permanence in these peaks came from understanding and collaboration, both with the land and with each other. From this understanding, the first hints of highland kingdoms were born, political structures rooted not in force, but in careful observation, patience, and the rhythm of life attuned to peaks, wind, and snow. By the end of the season, the settlers had transformed the plateau from a mere outpost of survival into a thriving highland settlement. The terraces held soil, water channels guided runoff predictably, and shelters had become permanent. The fire rituals persisted, reinforcing memory, observation, and identity. Paths between terraces and shelters were well worn, and the early exchanges with neighboring valleys had begun to knit a broader network of highland communities. Knowledge, labor, and endurance had converged to create stability. The mountain, patient and indifferent in some ways, had recognized persistence, respect, and care, qualities that would define highland rule for generations. As twilight fell, the settlers gathered one last time around the central fire, their faces illuminated by the warm glow against the cool spring air. Stories were recounted slowly, pauses stretching to allow reflection, repetition of motifs creating a meditative rhythm. The mountain was always present, silent, commanding, and patient, its peaks, terraces, and streams embedding themselves into the settlers' identity. And in this quiet communion, they understood that kingdoms were born not in conquest, but in the patient shaping of land, culture, and community, each step deliberate, each action observed, each life intertwined with the rhythm of the highlands. The first highland kingdoms had emerged, not as grand empires yet, not with crowns or banners, but with careful terraces, enduring shelters, shared knowledge, and rituals that synchronized human life with the pulse of the mountains. And as night deepened, stars glittering sharply in the thin air, the settlers lay in their shelters, listening to the wind and the murmur of streams, aware that their labor, patience, and respect had planted the seeds of permanence. In that stillness, the mountains seemed almost to acknowledge them, and the first highland thrones, forged in stone, frost, and enduring rhythm, were quietly, undeniably in place.